Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Welcome. For those of you here for the first time, I'm Rhoda Shermer. I'm the president of Network for Responsible Public Policy. And I thank you so much for coming because I know there's so many other events tonight. So I'm glad you're here. I also want to thank FDU, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley and the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn for helping to sponsor this program tonight. And I want to thank all of you who are able to contribute because, as you know, we could use your help. It keeps our programs coming. So before I introduce you to Peggy Lascala, our issues coordinator, and we start the program, I want to remind you that we have a couple of good programs coming up. On November 1st, we will be at Westfield High School in Westfield. That's our first program in Union County. And we'll be doing a program there on gerrymandering. And then back here at FDU on November 8th, we have a really exciting program with political experts who will give us an analysis and discussion of the November election results. And that's going to be really good, so make sure you come to that. So now, let me introduce you to Peggy Lascala, and she will introduce the speakers. Thanks so much.
Make this mistake every time I don't lift the mic. Hi, good evening, everybody. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Tonight, we have Nicole Gelinas. She's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a columnist at the New York Post. She writes on urban economics and finance. She is a CFA charter holder and the author of After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. Our other discussant tonight is Thomas Prusa. He's a professor of economics at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He received his PhD from Stanford University. He has published over 50 articles in leading journals and books. And for almost 50 years, Professor Prusa's research has focused on trade policy decision-making in the U.S. International Trade Commission. Our moderator this evening is Peter Coy. He is economics editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. He writes on a wide range of economic, social, and financial issues. He's a regular contributor to the magazine's Remarks column. Mr. Coy came to Businessweek from the Associated Press in New York, where he served as a business news writer since 1995. Welcome.
Welcome. Our topic today this evening is the middle class. And we have two excellent speakers. I'm going to be doing a minimum of moderating, a maximum of listening, because I want to learn too. And I would like maybe Nicole to start out with some general remarks, then Tom give his sort of general thoughts. But we'll keep those remarks fairly short because we want to have this be a conversation. And then fairly early on, we want to open it up to you so it can be an interactive session. So I'm going to start out with Nicole. What do you think is the situation with, say, America's middle class today, and what could be done? And this is directions from Rhoda. She wants us to be positive, solutions-oriented. So what could be done to make things better?
All right, well, thank you, Peter. And I'm going to start out with a question, too. I'd like to know what people think of who is in the middle class and how do we define middle class. And so I'd like you to raise your hand when you think I've gotten to the middle class and put your hand down when you think I've gone beyond the middle class. So if you're making $25,000 a year, are you middle class? Okay, not too many takers. If you're making $40,000, are you middle class? That's a good question. Well, we'll say here, northern New Jersey. So, yeah. Okay, no, very few takers at 40,000. All right, how about 75,000? All right, good. 110,000. Good. 150,000. 175. I feel like I'm an auctioneer. right, we still got some hands up. All right, 200. And then very few, no 200. So we are defining the middle class broadly between 40,000 to 175,000. And people tend to think of middle class as in the range of what they make, which makes it politically interesting when politicians ever want to raise taxes. They have to make sure that they don't propose any taxes on people who think those tax increases would fall on them, even though statistically, in many cases, they do fall on the wealthy. And so, as Peter said, what's the current situation with the middle class, and what can be done to improve both the perception and the reality of people's fortunes? I'll leave the trade stuff to Tom, who's the real expert here on trade, but I wanted to talk about something that is related to trade, which is the financialization of the American economy over the past 40 years. In fact, it's very related to trade. If you think back to the early 1980s, Wall Street and the financial industry was a very small industry related to the rest of the national economy. It was a big part of New York's economy. It was a significant, although smaller, part of northern New Jersey's economy. But in terms of the importance of Wall Street, investment banks, financial industry to the national economy, it was not very large at all. It was a supporting industry to what people thought of as the real economy: manufacturing, trade, goods, other services. That Wall Street was there if you were a merchant and you wanted financing to do your trade. If you had customers that would not be able to pay you for a few months, you would go out, find merchant financing, be paid, and so that you could go on and do your next orders while you were waiting for your customers to pay you. If you wanted to expand a factory, you would go out, float a bond. The Wall Street would arrange that type of bond financing. It was a very simple industry. The people in the industry were well paid, but they were well paid more like the richest person in your town. They weren't well paid like millionaires and in some cases billionaires. And so what started to happen in the early 1980s, we started to feel pressure with trade in terms of the US losing manufacturing, in some cases to automation, in some cases overseas. And of course, that started with the Northeast losing its manufacturing jobs to the southern part of the U.S. and then later on to overseas. You know, the never-ending quest for cheaper labor, less intrusive environmental and other regulations that brings manufacturers further and further afield of where the consumer markets are. So in the 1980s, we started to have the Rust Belt. We started to see the hollowing out of big manufacturing centers around the country, in the Midwest, in western Massachusetts, and upstate New York, even in central New Jersey. A lot of manufacturing jobs were lost here. And what we did, not really on purpose, but it just sort of happened to work out this way, is that as middle-class people who were related to the manufacturing industry either lost their jobs or they saw income losses as they struggled to keep up with these changes, we started to financialize the U.S. economy. In other words, where people in the middle class were not making raises and they were not making gains in their income, they started to borrow to make up for those losses. And I'll give you a couple of statistics. Back in 1980, and these numbers come from the Federal Reserve, they put them out every quarter, households in the U.S., so this is not businesses, this is not the federal government, this is not state and local government, but just households, people had borrowed $1.4 trillion altogether. That's how much, you take all the people in America, put them together, that's how much money that they owed. That's on their mortgages, that's on their credit cards, that's on their auto loans, that's on their student loans. Whatever type of debt a consumer can take on, they owed $1.4 trillion. fast forward to 2018, the second quarter of 2018, Americans owed $15.4 trillion. So over roughly 40 years, 1980 to 2018, American household debt has increased by 10 times. You've gone from 1.4 trillion to 15.4 trillion. Over that same time period, inflation has only increased about 3 times. So the rate of debt growth has been more than 3 times faster than the rate of inflation. And the population has grown about 44%, so less than 1 time. And so that you have a rate of debt growth that far exceeds both population growth and inflation growth. What did people end up borrowing all this money for? It's really nothing very fancy. It is just their day-to-day spending. Now, you can say, well, that's not true. They borrow money on their mortgages. That's their biggest source of debt is their mortgages, and indeed, that is the case. Back in 1980, Americans owned less than $1 trillion on mortgages. Today, they own $10 trillion on their mortgages. But people use their houses as a wellspring for consumer debt. And many of you, I'm sure, are in this situation where you've got a house, you got a mortgage, you try to pay a little bit of the mortgage off every month, but the credit cards pile up. Your income is just a little bit behind your spending, and you're not being extravagant, and that you've got kids going to school, you have a car that needs repair, someone takes some time off from work. Suddenly you're looking at 4, 5, 10, even more than that in credit card debt. And so what do? You go and you refinance the house, you pay off your credit cards, and you kind of start over with your mortgage. And what enables this is a policy of interest rates. For these same 40 years, roughly, we've had a national policy of low interest rates, extremely low over the past decade. But the policy of the US government has been to keep interest rates very low. Why is that? To make borrowing easier. What does that mean? People's house values have gone up, other asset values have gone up, and we are stuck in this situation where we have to maintain very high housing values so that people can continually use these as an ATM and eventually a source of retirement income. This is a long-winded way of saying the financialization of the economy, and with that, the growth of Wall Street and financial engineering becoming ever more complex, people on Wall Street being paid much more than they used to be, which, by the way, has actually been good for the New York and the Northern New Jersey economies, not so good for the national economies. This has been a safety valve. It's almost like our social safety net is borrowing, and just borrowing as much as we can at as low interest rates as we can. If we were to get rid of this safety valve and have normalized interest rates, higher interest rates, lower housing prices where people were not using houses as a piggy bank, then we could start to deal with some of the underlying problems, which is the issue of losing some of the middle-class jobs and the middle-class income. But for as long as we use the financial system as a crutch, it is very difficult to get to these underlying causes, which now, hopefully, we can talk about some of those.
Nicole, I agree with most of what you said, but you mentioned sort of in passing that housing values have gone up. So somebody who's more of an optimist on this would look at it and say, well, the net worth of the household is actually much higher now because although they owe more, they also own more. What about that?
Well, housing is obviously a very fraught topic politically. A high housing value is good, and I wrote some things down about housing values too. If you bought a house in Bergen County back in 1994, you paid on average $239,000 for it. If you were to buy a house today, it would be $551,000. So another increase that has far outpaced inflation. It's very good if you bought a house a long time ago, you didn't take any money out of it, and you're turning around and looking to sell it. It's not very good if you're a young family looking to buy a house and stay in the area, or you haven't built up enough equity in this house because you've spent 20 years taking money out of the house to keep financing your lifestyle. So yes, it is an asset, but is it good that the asset value is so high? I'm not so sure that it is. It's sort of, do you think about your house as an investment, or do you think of it as a cost of living? Very few people would be glad if we said, oh gee, the price of bananas was $5 last year and now it's $20. We sure made a lot of money. Well, no, because you have to pay more to feed yourself. And for people who don't think of housing as an investment or just looking for a place to live, it's gotten much more difficult to live anywhere in the Northeast.
Okay, great. Switch over to Tom now. Your thoughts on where the middle class is and what could be done to make things better.
Right. Well, thank you for having me here. I've taught for 30 years, and I normally teach a considerably younger audience. But Rutgers regularly has senior citizens who come and sit in on classes, and I always learn a lot. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions tonight and learning from you. When I was asked to come up here and talk this evening, the general topic I was told we would be talking about was inequality issues, and specifically my role might be to flesh out some of the role that international trade has played and the rising inequality in the United States. So let me first go back and just say a few things that I think are, I think it's a well-known joke that if you have two economists in a room, you have three opinions. But I think on general issues, broad issues, I mean, the facts are the facts, despite what we might hear out of Washington. Economists widely agree there are three main causes for rising inequality. Number one, let's first get it clear. There is unambiguous evidence inequality is rising in the United States dramatically. In my generation, I'm not proud of it. I feel like I'm leaving my children a bad legacy. It's much, much worse inequality. Is say post-1980, the last almost 40 years, it's become dramatically worse. The data is unambiguous. In many parts of the world, inequality has fallen over the last 40 years. In Western Europe and the United States, it's risen. Let's talk about causes. Three main causes economists identify. We can debate solutions to them, but let's just try to identify what the three causes are that I think most of us agree are very important driving factors. Number one, technology change. It is mind-boggling the speed. I think all of us in this room, that's when I'm frustrated when I talk to my 21-year-olds in class. They don't have any memory of the world pre-internet. They have no memory of a world where they didn't walk around with a computer in their pocket. Those of us who are just a little bit older, ripe at the prime of our life, I remember the first calculator I had, and I was amazed at the power of a little 4-function calculator. It was just the greatest toy. I just couldn't imagine what I could do with that calculator. Technology change has been profound in our lifetime. It's changed how work is done, and it's changed the distribution of wealth in the economy. Number two, international trade. In combination with technology, the dramatic increase of trade post-World War II has led to opening up great economic opportunity around the world for people who were previously locked in a lifetime of living in the most utter poverty you can imagine, right? International trade has given millions, hundreds of millions of extremely poor people an opportunity to produce and trade their wares more broadly. When you combine the growth of international trade with the way technology has changed, it's affected particularly the inequality of people with low skills, right? So when I teach international economics, it's unambiguously the case that trade is good for the United States. Trade is good generically for, tell me the country, I will strongly argue that trade increases the welfare of the typical average person. But that does not mean it makes the welfare of everyone in the country better off, nor does it mean the benefits are shared equally, right? We know there might be a handful of people, Jeff Bezos, for instance, who's obtained, John D. Rockefeller type wealth by leveraging technology and the ability to hire many, many low-skilled workers. So low-skilled workers have been really adversely affected by those two trends. And then third, and we have to be blunt with this, government policy. Inequality hasn't risen in other countries in the world, or not all countries, like it's risen in the United States, right? The government has made choices in the name of economic efficiency, if you want to take the government's justification for certain policies at face value. But a number of government policy changes have moved in the direction of shifting more and more wealth to a set of the population, often people because of their roles in businesses that are already very well off, at the expense of income distribution to the low. We're aware that the worker share of corporate income is just falling, right? So if you're a worker, your share of what the company, the price, what they get for the product is falling over time. This doesn't mean that all workers are worse off, but it means there's a set of workers who are very vulnerable and worse off. So there are three key things: technology, trade, government policy. We need to wrestle with how we can perhaps use government policy to try to assist if we believe inequality is a serious problem. When I teach my students, I tell them the two major issues going forward in their lifetime is economic inequality and healthcare. Healthcare is related to inequality. These are going to be in their lifetime, and these little beautiful 19 and 20-year-old kids. That's their optimism and enthusiasm is tremendous. They are going to face serious economic challenges that we are leaving them. And one is profound economic inequality in our country. And until we do, again, I think the question is what can the government do in terms of policies to help reduce, if that's, again, this is a question whether the government even cares about economic inequality. And again, I'm thinking the national government. We'd have to work hard, and that would mean if we're going to start to address economic inequality, that means some of what's been given to the wealthy has to be taken away. And that's very, very hard to do, right? So it's now become an entitlement that their tax rates will be low, all that other, issues in the tax code will benefit only the very wealthy. So I think those would be my three big takeaways. I'd like to come back to these in a number of contexts this evening about how we can talk about those three issues.
Tom, let me ask you about why inequality is a bad thing. And I'm playing devil's advocate a bit here. Mm-hmm. There are people who would say, it's fine, I don't care if Jeff Bezos is worth $150 billion if he has done things that make me 15% better off. And if there's a government policy that benefits some people extraordinarily, but benefits everybody else somewhat, isn't that better than not having that policy? What's your reaction to that?
Right, so I will. There is value judgments in this, right? And there are a lot of economists who will take that position. That's not my position. My view is economic inequality is not good, right? And in fact, I would even say it further. Taking small amounts, whatever taking means, transferring income probably via the tax code, I guarantee that Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos, to name two, will never, ever, ever, ever in their generation, in the next 500 generations of their family, be able to spend the wealth that they have. I travel the world a lot. It's one of the great benefits of my job. And I don't see homeless people everywhere I travel. I see homeless people everywhere in the United States. This is a policy choice we've made for our country, that we think the richest country in the world. I can't believe, it's not true that we can't afford it. We are not Argentina. We are the United States, the richest country in the world. It is a policy choice to say that we would prefer to have people who are so poor that they can't have a roof over their heads. And if they have issues that they aren't able to work, you can make a decision how to try to assist these people in their life. So I'm not advocating for a giant welfare state, but I do think it is a value judgment, and we all as Americans have to decide what values do we think is important as a country. And to the extent that I walk out of my office as I walk to lunch, now in New Brunswick, I walk past homeless people. That was not the case 20 years ago in New Brunswick, that I walked past homeless people on my way to get, my sandwich.
So I'd like to ask both of you, maybe you first, Tom, what do you think are the incentive effects of tax cuts for the rich? Do you think that they incentivize the rich to work harder and produce more wealth that benefits to society?
Okay, so I do believe incentive effects matter a lot. Do I believe additional tax cuts for any, again, we can argue about where the cutoff is. Let's just say it's $1 million a year of income. I don't know, we could argue about what the actual number might be. I don't believe that people that I know who are very successful, I view, not Jeff Bezos successful, but very successful, they work and are driven. It's partly by income, but it's partly by they absolutely are passionate and love their jobs. They are driven because they are deeply, deeply interested and passionate about either a business deal, mergers and acquisitions, science, law. These people are driven, I don't think the idea that they might take home an extra $25,000 because of the lax tax cut, I don't think that makes them stay late on a Wednesday night to work. I think they stay late on a Wednesday night to work because they find their job incredibly interesting. And the income is nice too, I don't mean to say that, but I don't think, in fact, tax cuts drive the incentive for people to work hard.
What do you think, Nicole?
Well, I think it depends what the tax rate is. It's not 1980 anymore, where one could argue and probably be correct that a 70% top tax rate on income or a 90% top tax rate on income is very different from a 39.6% top tax rate on income. In the Reagan era tax cuts, bringing the rate down from 70% to closer to 40%, that made a much bigger difference in changing people's behavior. The federal tax law from last Christmas, you're just tinkering a little bit within the high 30s. That doesn't change people's behavior as much, partly because the fiscal environment is also very different. I mean, one of the arguments of the Reagan tax cuts was, well, we'll cut the budget. We never did that. We've just, I don't know if any of you ever read David Stockman's book. Stockman was Reagan's budget director. He was a young man at the time, very idealistic in his way, and he really believed that we were going to cut the federal budget. So he put his glasses on, he went through every line in the budget, said this is what we're going to cut, this, and that. And everyone said no. I mean, the Republicans in Congress liked their programs, the Democrats liked their programs. Despite all of the drama in those years about cutting education spending, cutting school food spending. Really, nothing was ever cut. In fact, Reagan was actually very good even to inner cities with transit spending. There were some issues in the first term, but he came around. It was during the Reagan era that things like the Big Dig were funded, that things like the Westway trade-in, where New York City got billions of dollars for its transit system. These were funded during the Reagan era. So we've had 40 years of reasonably low to mid tax rates with spending that outpaces them. And so if I'm a wealthy person today and I'm relatively young, I'm thinking my tax rate may be low today, but it's going up. I mean, the income tax cuts of last fall, without massive spending cuts that the U.S. government has never shown the political will to do. At some point, economics would tell you this must be paid for. Now, over 40 years, it's never had to be paid for. It may be that we cannot pay for these things forever because the other alternatives that people have to make investments in the world are even worse than putting your money into U.S. Treasury bonds. But so far, that's been the case. This debt has not been repaid, whether it's federal debt or consumer debt. At some point, you would think it's unsustainable, but who knows? Perhaps it can just go on forever. But if it does end, and if global investors demand more money to lend money to the U.S. government, then of course tax rates are going to go up, and of course they'll go up on the wealthy first because that's politically the easiest place to do it. So in some ways the tax cut is just a distraction. I can pay you now or I can pay you tomorrow. It doesn't really matter. Now I think the corporate tax cut was good, but a smaller, more modest corporate tax cut and largely leave the personal income, the tax side alone, that would have been much more sustainable. I mean, what we've done is we've put the corporate tax cut in peril too because of the unsustainable nature of the whole package. Because the corporate tax rate here, it was higher than in Europe and in Japan.
Let me just a minute longer on this idea. So again, I do believe there's room for legitimate disagreement on some of these issues, right? I have a position, and I know the problem is I think many of us are frustrated with the apparent lack of, does any facts and any things that were previously said still matter? Can you just say whatever you want? When we did the Reagan tax cuts, to your point on incentive effects, right, there is a widely agreed upon economic idea. It's been dubbed the Laffer curve, this idea that at some point taxes are so high, when personal income taxes were 70%, and in other countries over 90%, right? The famous Taxman song by the Beatles, right? When you're getting more than 90 cents of every dollar you earn taxed. The idea that at some point the taxes are so high, it is going to discourage work. So by lowering the tax rate, you could actually get people to work harder, and so taxes could actually go up despite the fact that the tax rate has gone down. Now, there has been no empirical evidence that the Laffer curve, we've ever been to that point, even the Reagan tax cuts. There's the empirical test of the idea that we had a Laffer curve effect there are rejected. Nevertheless, in every tax cut debate, and I guarantee every tax cut debate going forward, someone on the side is going to argue that the tax cut will pay for itself. There is no evidence, and even if it was possibly true in 1980, when personal tax rates, the highest, were 70%. That's a plausible argument at that point. It is not plausibly the case that moving from 22% to 20% is going to generate enough extra income to pay for the tax cut. So I do think incentive effects are there and do matter, but we haven't, the very, very good tax research has been done, and they haven't been able to detect this, the idea that the incentive effects overwhelms the reduction in revenue from the lower rates. And it's certainly not the case at the current rates. I don't think any tax economist believes that argument.
Okay, great. I want to explore something that's just implicit in our conversation here, which is we have two goals here. One is to help the middle class, and one is to alleviate extreme inequality, to help the homeless in New Brunswick. And those could be contradictory in certain cases, because it could be that in order to help the poor, you need to raise taxes on the middle class. Unless you think you can get all the money from Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett. So when they model these things, they have to figure out, okay, we can either have 90% tax rates on the very richest, or we can kind of bump them up. But the less we extract from the very rich, the more we have to go down and down and down into the middle class. So maybe I'll start with you, Tom. I mean, where do you think is the right balance on that?
I think you're right. I mean, we even as rich as we are, we can't afford everything. I agree with that. There's probably going to be some policy limitations. But I think what you're highlighting actually is one of the challenges of extreme economic inequality. You're right. There's not enough to solve both state and federal level tax problems. There's not enough money to tax the middle class, because the actual income of the middle class is too small. Again, you have, like it or not, because we have other policies and other factors driving inequality, it makes tax policy harder, because there's less and less of the share of the income in the bottom, not just 50%, but the bottom 80% of the population. So that does mean that you have to target, arguably unfairly, very disproportional tax increases for the rich. But that the reason that is the reality we're dealing with in the modern United States is because the bottom 80% have so little. And it is hard to solve New Jersey's tax problem and the federal government's tax problem if we just try to tax the middle class or equally. So in politically, the top 10%, particularly the top 2%, have extreme economic or political power, and it makes it hard to tax them, or even if it's not taxing, engaging in other policies that would lead to greater income equality. So I do think it's a very, very difficult policy problem. I mean, I wish it was just easy to make it just right on the board here, 5 simple solutions and we're done. These are very, very challenging problems from the policymaker perspective, because the inequality problem is so problematic.
Cool. We're going to do questions. She wants to. I was going to switch to questions from the audience right after this. So,
Yeah, if you're a full-time resident of New York City in particular, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts actually not so much anymore, you're already paying tax rates that are closer to what people pay in Europe. You pay, depending on how much money you make, but if you're fortunate enough to make the low 6 figures, you're paying a federal income tax, a state income tax, and a local income tax. If you're making high 6 figures or above that, your tax rate is pretty close to 50% if you haven't sheltered a lot of your income outside of these states. And these states and cities have a huge safety net programs. So the spending on public health care, Obamacare, homeless services, education services, per capita student, public school spending is the highest in the nation in all of these northeastern states, well above $20,000 a year. And so the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic is what tax rates look like with a much bigger social safety net. It's often not competently implemented. Despite all this spending, we still have people sleeping on the streets of New York, and that's for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons are not financial. We have shelters, but they're not safe, so people prefer to sleep on the subway. If you are a drug addict, you come to Manhattan and sit on the street because you can raise money sitting on the street in Manhattan. You cannot raise money sitting in your working class suburban home on the street. So wealthier cities, denser places, and places that do have stronger safety nets attract more troubled populations. And this is true around the world. If you go to London, you will see people sleeping on the street, just as you see here. If you go to Paris, there are refugees and economic migrants now from Africa and from the Middle East who have pitched tent cities under the railroad arches. And this is the problems that the US saw 35 years ago have come to Europe, and Europe is struggling with these same issues and struggling with them not very well, the way that we have struggled with them not very well. But this is another long-winded way of saying, in the rest of the country, if demographic trends, fiscal trends, the trends of the fact that places like New York used to be where the urban problems were of crime, homelessness, drug addiction. A lot of those problems now are in the suburbs. So you look at some of the crime problems on Long Island, you look at the pretty much any southern city where the cost of living is lower has a violent crime rate that is multiple times the violent crime rate of New York City. These places have done poor urban planning. They don't do the education and other spending that we do. The long-term trend is that spending in these places goes up, whether we pay for that through federal taxes or state and local taxes. We still don't know. It's probably more efficient to do it at the federal level. But over time, unless something big really changes in the country, middle-class people as well as upper-class people will pay closer to European style tax rates, which is what we already pay in the Northeast. And it still is not a panacea for deep poverty.
Before we go to the audience, I want to ask each of you the Rhoda question, which is, out of your 5 or 10 solutions, what's one you'd just like to throw out because you really like it and you feel like a government policy that would specifically help the middle class? Let's put it that way. I'll start with Tom. It could be taxes or whatever.
It doesn't affect me personally. I guess let me say two. One would be I think it's a crime that we're in the richest country in the world and 20% of Americans don't have health care insurance. I mean, I'm sorry. It's just it's I can't believe it. So that affects all Americans. Number two, we should have far better support for mothers who have children. Other countries have way more support to help mothers continue in the workforce when they have a child. America is lagging terribly behind, and that affects half of American working adults, and that feeds into inequality issues for women.
Great. And Nicole?
I think we have to tackle the healthcare cost issue. I mean, the reason we can't invest, well, one of the reasons we can't invest enough in infrastructure is we're spending the money on healthcare. I mean, we have the most inefficient healthcare system in the world. Whether you're on Medicaid or you're fortunate like me to have a good healthcare plan, the bureaucracy, the deductibles, the costs involved in this, we have to address these at the cost issue, not the make the consumer pay more issue, which is the way we've dealt with it over the past 25 years. The only thing that got you was that everyone hates their health care now. You know, back when Hillary was proposing Hillary Care, I guess 1993, 94, there were those ads with the family that said, "You're going to lose your health care. Don't you love your health care? You're going to lose your plan." I don't think today anyone would care. Is there anyone who likes their Aetna or their United or their Oxford plan? I mean, to me, the health care plan is that you get money taken out of your check every month, but if you do get sick, you have to pay $6,000 before you actually can use your health insurance. I mean, I know that this makes sense in some way economically, but the political mood is ripe for serious healthcare reform, partly because of the very bad decisions the entire industry and both parties have made over 25 years.
But do you have any specific ideas of what could be done to rein in costs?
Well, I mean, the whole Medicaid system is just a system of opaque kickbacks and fraud. I mean, for example, children, they go to school. There's a place where they could get day-to-day health care. It's in the school, just like we give out free breakfast, free lunch, and in some cases free dinners into schools. The health care point of delivery for the average child should be in the school. You could have a doctor that spends a day at each school. Same with dental care. The dental care should be in the schools, and this is much, much cheaper than all of the Medicaid contracting systems that we've built up. That's one place to start, is we have a system that benefits campaign donors and the wrong kind of entrepreneurs.
Great. Okay. So, how do we get to handle the questions from the audience?
As we're moving into the Q&A, I just have a couple of rules. We want everybody to have a chance to ask a question. So please only ask one question at a time, because I know sometimes you want to engage in a series of questions, but we want to give everybody a chance to get their question asked. So one question at a time, and try to, if you're going to make a comment, please make it very brief, okay?
All right.
Thank you.
No.
I think so. No.
There we go.
I wanted to apologize for my enthusiasm before.
We like it.
I can't help. I actually ran for Senate last year in the primary, and so I'm very passionate about these issues. And when we were talking about the fair tax rate, if you're so wealthy that you're making 400 times more than your average worker, how can you argue that we can
Hold the
have
mic closer to your mouth.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what part I got lost, but I'll start with the question. If you're so wealthy that you're earning 400% more than your average worker, how can you argue that you can have an equal tax rate? I mean, I understand that people don't want to spend a 90% tax rate, but when you're talking about this large injustice, the correction of the large injustice is going to at least look unjust.
Yeah, sure.
So, right, one of the measures, as I said, there's a number of ways economists have measured increased economic inequality, and you struck on one of them, and that is, it's just one of the measures, which is the difference between the average worker's pay and then the CEO's pay in a typical corporation. And it's grown dramatically over the last 40 years, and it is a problem. And the justification for it would be is that CEO, as delivering for his company tremendous value and company growth, et cetera. The problem with that argument is, so I'm in agreement with you, because the problem with that argument is we're seeing tremendous multiples of CEO pay to the typical worker's pay across all corporations, crappy corporations and great corporations. We see dramatic income inequality. These measures are not being tied to the economic, right? Economists could come up with an argument saying, absolutely, Jeff Bezos does deserve this giant salary, right? We could, but the problem is Bob Schmidt, and how about the guy who bankrupts Sears? I mean, how this guy is making 300 times more than typical Sears employee. He didn't do it based on productivity, right? So that is yet another metric of inequality, and that's one of the problems for the country, is when so much wealth is at the very high end, to think of solutions to address middle-class issues means we're dealing with, this economic inequality problem. The pool which we can tax, where the real money is gotten very, very small.
Do you have any?
I also think in all the talk about taxes, we may forget that there are other ways to address these issues. The question Peter raised, should Jeff Bezos make all of this money because he's doing so much good for the world? Well, let's question the premise. I mean, this is a mechanism to make consumption of produced products that are produced very cheaply overseas. It's a mechanism to make it easier for Americans to consume these products. So do we have to think about the trade deficit? There's nothing wrong with trade, with one country having a comparative advantage over another in a certain product or service and trading back and forth. But the level of trade deficits that we've built up, if you have a trade deficit with one country that's $500 billion a year, this starts to cause social, political, economic problems. And so Amazon is almost an extension of the goods that we purchase via this huge trade deficit, which again gets back to my original point. How are people paying for all this stuff? They're borrowing money to pay for it. And so do we need to really think about the consumer-based economy, that we want to go back to good jobs for people who produce things rather than substandard jobs for people who consume things? It is hard to accomplish that through the tax policy. We could think about doing it, and Trump, albeit rather imperfectly, is doing it, and not any different from what Obama did. Unfair trade practices, dumping of products below cost. China had a massive steel surplus. They did not want to lose any jobs, so they just exported this stuff, dumped it at very low prices. If you have a centrally planned communist economy dumping hundreds of billions of goods into your economy, isn't your economy being distorted by a centrally planned communist system? You know, no one seemed to have thought about that until Trump came along. So I think taxes are important, but fair trade policies and regulatory policies that mean a company like Amazon doesn't get a benefit in being able to sell to people who don't have to pay the sales tax, which was the case for the first 18 years of their existence. These things matter too.
Great. Next question. I'll let Rhoda figure out who to call on. She'll be the heavy.
Don't throw tomatoes at me.
Okay, we got one right here.
All right, the gentleman in the middle.
Oh.
I'm sorry, you get it. Hello?
No, I'm used to it. The women always get seconds.
He was waving his hand.
Okay, here's the deal. You haven't mentioned at all carbon tax. And I see the eventuality of carbon tax, so I think either you don't think it's significant in what you're talking about, or it is. I mean, wealthy people who consume more energy, will have to pay more for that energy, and supposedly that money will be used to offset the income taxes so that the government is revenue neutral, but this carbon tax provides a significant amount of money that's not the income tax.
Okay, good. What you want to start with that one this time?
I think a carbon tax makes a lot of sense, and as you said, offset this by putting the money back into more productive investment areas of the economy. But I think there has to be some kind of mechanism to have it apply to what people consume, not to what they produce. So in other words, it can't just fall on industries that choose to still produce things in the US and pay our higher energy costs and our higher environmental costs. It has to be some kind of tax attached to what you were actually purchasing, even if the carbon used to make that was emitted somewhere else. But the general concept that we want to tax consumption and carbon is consumption is certainly sound.
Yeah, so I'll say that this carbon taxes, you can tell you're an economist when you're in favor of carbon taxes, right? There's a lot of support among economists that carbon taxes should be playing a role, but as we just heard, this is more complicated than you think. International production is one reason why carbon taxes are hard, because U.S. companies will complain that we have a carbon tax, but name your other country, whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam, or whether it's a Latin American country, is not doing a carbon tax. So we would really need a global agreement. It would be very helpful. But economist, and I'm in totally agreement with you, the idea that that would be a very effective, and actually, I think welfare increasing, right? We're really worried about carbon production. That would be a great policy. Politically very difficult.
Can you just, since you're a trade guy, what about Nicole's idea that you find a way to impose it on the carbon content of final goods?
Right. The problem is, so we'd have to, and unfortunately this is not going to happen with President Trump, we would really, under the WTO rules, you would have a problem of putting tariffs differentially on goods that have high carbon versus low carbon production. So we would have to go and negotiate agreements that are forward-looking and thoughtful to realize what the real problems are in the economy. So under the current agreements, you can't do that. We're bound to treat the goods symmetrically without that taken into account. Because, right, so if you, suppose we're talking a country that's doing a lot of production with solar power or renewable power, and they're producing a product and they're competing with another country that's using coal. They're both exporting automobiles to the United States, suppose, right? The energy non-carbon using, what I would say progressive country, doesn't want to be paying the carbon tax, but we can't have a different tariff on an automobile from country A than we do from country B under WTO rules. So we'd have to really amend. That's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Find some.
Okay, now Judy.
Okay. I think the first step to inequality is returning some power to workers, because over this last decline since Reagan took office, starting with PATCO, we've had union memberships declining at about the same rate that wages have declined and stagnated. And you're all talking about trade and deficits, and nobody's talking about just paying the worker. We have increased productivity, we have not increased wages, because the idea has gone to the fact that, oh, I own the company, I deserve the money from this productivity. What about the people who are actually doing the work to make the goods, to make all those other people rich? How do we get people paid better? Because that's the biggest step to inequality. And then you don't have to borrow on your house. You can just use your paycheck. And if you let me talk longer, I'll start singing Woody Guthrie, so I won't bother.
If you look at the only sector of the economy that's really still unionized, it's the public sector, the government sector. And I think government sector, not so much the unionization, but the political power of the government unions is problematic, because you look at something like the Long Island Railroad productivity rules. They haven't changed in 50 years. They haven't kept up with technology. And so you're paying people, $150,000 to work on the railroad, and this money is the money that's not going into your infrastructure. I have no objection to private sector unionization at all, because there's a natural checks and balance that if the unions ask for too much, the company will go bankrupt, and that's not in anyone's interest at all. And so the unionization moves in the retail sector and the services sector, the fast food Fight for 15, which wasn't a formal union effort, but a sort of collective effort. As long as these things stay in the private sector, I think these are good developments, but it is hard to achieve much in a world where you can produce the same goods and in some cases the same services overseas for a much lower cost.
Thoughts?
I don't know if I have anything more to say than, I mean, I feel your frustration, right? I mean, I don't have a solution for it. You have to, technology, that's one example. There is a trade issue. There's also, technology has challenged American workers in a way, and you want to have more workers say, I agree with you that the decline of the union, there have been problems with some unions that they've been, I'm in a public union at Rutgers, and the union quite often is headstrong for the I don't think we're progressive enough for the benefit of long-run value of the university over a short-run policy issue they're unwilling to negotiate on. But American workers are being challenged by more than the loss of unionization. They're being challenged by international trade, as was cited, but technology. Let me just mention one thing, because it does relate to trade. We've had one of the things that kicked off Trump's after he got the tax package, he turned to trade, and one of the big things was steel tariffs. There's a lot of misinformation about steel. Steel workers then are dramatically down. Steel production is not down. We produce the same amount of steel now that we did 40 years ago. We do it with about 1/5 the number of workers that we did 40 years ago. And so excuse me? He might, yeah, I think you're right. So I think the challenge therefore there are some communities that have been really hollowed out because of the decline of the number of workers at the steel mills. But that's almost entirely a technology-driven phenomenon. The steel facilities are just super efficient now compared to the way they used to be.
Well, it's also dumping, sorry.
No, next, one question at a time.
I was expecting you to mention that the Chinese dumping steel in the U.S. market at below cost.
But the Chinese have already had, before President Trump came into office, almost all the Chinese steel have already had anti-dumping duties imposed on them. So that was, there are rules in place. China does have tremendous overcapacity in steel. What you were saying about China is very reluctant to shut down some of their weaker mills, just as actually the United States is reluctant to shut down. We don't want to hurt Wharton, West Virginia, even though their mills should be shut down, because that will devastate the town. China has that in spades. But at least with respect to the United States, the surge of Chinese steel was almost entirely contained before President Trump put his tariffs on. So the idea that he wants to contain Chinese steel, well, that can't be true, because Chinese steel only accounts for 7% of U.S. steel imports, right? So,
More than 1/3 unionized in this country. We never had more than 1/3. But what people forget is that gave workers as a whole power. It provided a floor for the whole rest of the economy. And the thing that bugs me in a discussion like this is that no one's talking about paying the people, with or without unions. The corporations are allowed, without even being ashamed, to show their faces, to say, oh, they don't need that. No, this is fine. I need 400 times what they're making. But
Okay.
they don't need a living wage.
Okay, that's,
Next question. Over here. Vilma. Michael.
Thank you. A couple of days ago, the New York Times published an article about Jared Kushner paid zero taxes. So it's the real estate developers who have this the loopholes where they just don't have to pay taxes. It's not just Jared Kushner. If these loopholes didn't exist, if government policy made it so that they didn't exist, would our economy suffer from lack of real estate development, or would we be better?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. I'm not a Trump fan, but I understand why Trump was elected. For people who are all up in arms and upset about Trump, Trump would not be president if it were not for 40 years of failure in New York City. And part of that is tax policy, that if you look at what Trump and now Kushner and other similar developers have been able to get away with in the tax corruption, both legal and illegal tax evasion and avoidance in New York City, the tax breaks. It is no wonder that people like Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort, thought that they would be able to get away with wrongdoing on the national level because Cohen was involved in heavily regulated New York City industries. Manafort had real estate money laundering issues in New York City. New York and northern New Jersey as well have always been ready to give away money on real estate when the real estate would have been built anyway. And you remember when Trump was saying, I donated money to Hillary Clinton. She came to my wedding because I wanted her there and she needed my money. I mean, this is the story of 40 years of New York. And so a lot of these tax problems start at the municipal and the state level, federal problem too. But the more aggressive tax auditors are always at the state level because it's you're getting a lot more from your state tax base. It's when I think about who to blame, Trump or Kushner, people get away with as much wrongdoing as they can get away with. It was the state and city's job to rein them in, and they never did. And to answer your question, if we close these loopholes, would it be bad for the economy? No. I mean, you're going to build property as long as people want to buy property. And I think we should also close the money laundering loopholes where the hundreds, even thousands of apartments in New York are purchased by people from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, from Mexico, from Brazil, all fine places, I'm sure, but people in China, people purchase property here because they don't want ill-gotten gains taken from them from their home governments, or if their government decides they're going to behead them one day, they want to have the property here if they can escape here. This is a massive distortion of our property market and having hundreds of millions of dollars of laundered money wash through New York. If you're a resident of New York and you're a foreigner, state who you are, who is the beneficial owner, a person, not a company, and purchase the property. These properties should not be purchased through these opaque companies by foreign nationals who are not U.S. residents. You don't have to be a citizen, just a resident.
I agree with you, right? For me, it's almost soul crushing, right? We sit here and argue whether it should be 22.5% or 20% personal income tax. And this matters to the person living in Omaha, Nebraska, bringing home $45,000 a year. The problem with the tax code, you often hear politicians talk, we need to simplify the tax code. That is a line of bull. It's the complexity. It's not the tax rates that we're bamboozled by. It is the thousands of pages of dense tax that allow perhaps legal maneuvers to do where people who make millions of dollars pay less than secretaries. And that is a huge problem that the politicians have no willingness to actually address. I don't believe they have any. They might be willing to address issues involving tax rates, but the real issues are what you struck on, which is deep in the tax code, provisions that, why would I know about this provision? And there's hundreds of them. There's different types of incredibly distortive provisions in Texas involving energy. There's different distortions involving ranchers. If you own 50,000 or more acres and 50,000 acres, come on, who owns 50,000 acres? So you're right, it's those type of, let's have a simplified tax code. I bet all of us in this room are going to benefit from a simplified tax code because the sweetness of the tax code is not what we get. It's by a small set of people who benefit from the opaqueness.
Okay, next question on this side of the room. Anybody? Okay, down here, Ethan.
is there too much capital tied up in our housing markets? I hate to say this, but are the upper middle class and the wealthy overhoused?
Yes, I think that's true. It's money has gone into housing that could have gone to more productive parts of the economy, and a lot of this is poor urban and suburban planning that's developers favor sprawl because it's cheaper for them to build. There's a lot of resistance to dense urban planning built around mass transit because it is more expensive, at least in the short term. So when you think about newer places that people want to live, Houston, Nashville, parts of Florida, very poorly planned communities where the costs come due much later, and building in constant flood zones, and building where it's an hour's drive to work and there's no other way to get to work. So if I'm poor, I'm on a bus for 3 hours a day and I lose my job because I can't get to work. So I think there is a density and a size issue with middle class and upper class housing.
You're talking kind of more density there, but what about just the size of houses, the value of houses, how many granite countertops and so on?
And how many houses each person has?
That all goes to federal policy of subsidizing house purchases. Almost every mortgage written in the country is guaranteed by the federal government. Only the very, very wealthy don't get a guaranteed mortgage. And so federal policy to lend money cheaply for housing purchases just gets you a much bigger house or a lot more money to put things into the house. I have no objection if someone wants nice kitchen counters or nice things within their house, but the federal policy encourages high housing prices and people buy more house than they otherwise could afford. And we can't change it because if we get rid of federal guarantees for housing, everyone who purchased a house, that price is going to go down because people who are coming into the market to purchase a house will have less money to do so. But I think that is a big problem.
I'm going to skip to this. Yeah.
Okay, question over here.
She has a mic.
Right over here. Thank you.
There's general agreement, I think, that lowering tariffs is good for the efficiency of the world economy. But I wonder, that's cost efficiency, and one of you was talking about the benefits of trade, but that's cost efficiency. I wonder, there are also benefits to localized economies. If you move away from cost efficiency and look at long-term health and effectiveness of the economy, so wages might be higher if you localize the economy and you did regulate tariffs. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Right. So tariffs go two ways. Right, so there's been some outstanding work over the last decade that has shown that areas of the country that have the production, the industries that were in the most intense competition from low-wage countries have suffered the greatest wage declines and work loss. Right, so it is clear that it's true what you're saying, which is, so the areas, it's not just generically, but the areas that are producing the laptop computers, if that might be the product. They've done excellent work. There's also been excellent work, though, that show that the areas of the greatest wage growth are areas that produce the goods that we export. Right? So if you want to have workers who are able to make, we have to have access to international markets. And so I believe the efficiency that gains at corporations and the benefits to consumers of low tariffs outweigh these other costs. There could be other policies we could do without distorting the cost of goods, but that's my opinion. And again, I think this is an area that reasonable people can have a serious debate about the pros and cons. I don't think it's a clear, obvious yes/no answer.
Okay, I'm going to, on behalf of the questioner, ask a follow-up to you. is there a way to preserve local production short of putting tariffs on imports?
I'm not even sure tariffs are going to preserve local production. I mean, so we've had the big issue. We've had 25% tariffs put on steel. There have been facilities that process steel that have expanded since this. There's been no new steel production. Raw steel production has not increased. Raw steel production has not increased, despite the fact that we have 25% tariffs on.
What about things like, I think a lot of times when people talk about, think global, act local, they're thinking about food, for example. It often comes up. We need to have domestic sources. What about something like that?
The agricultural sector has undergone incredible technology change. 100 years ago, before World War I, almost a third of the American workforce worked on farms. Almost a third. Now it's less than 5% of the American workforce. And as someone who grew up in Nebraska, I can tell you the devastating effects in rural Nebraska. There are towns that are just empty without that. That being said, we produce far more food. Name the type of food. We produce far more food in 2018 than we did in 1908, despite the fact there's far fewer workers on the farms. So it's hard to see how, given the efficiency that happens on the large farms, it's hard for a small farmer in New Jersey. And Hillsborough does have, where I live, has some small farmers. I don't see how their problem is not imported agricultural products. Their problem is farmers in Nebraska can grow corn and hogs way cheaper than we can in New Jersey. That's their competitive problem.
Okay.
I'd like to see show of hands of how many more questions there are so we can get a sense of what. So one,
Too many. Yeah.
Two more?
No, I'd say at least 3 over here.
4.
Okay, let's do this side of the room.
Hi there, thank you. The bursting in my seat. First of all, I appreciate your analysis that the technology, international trade, and government policy all contributed to the situation. However, the technology is something that we've always had, and it's ironic to some extent that Amazon, the guy that owns Amazon, is going to be worth $150 billion at the same time that Sears is going out of business, because it's basically the same thing. The Sears Roebuck catalog in the 1800s was the equivalent of today's Amazon. And so those kind of things, the markets can adapt. The international trade is good for everybody because rarely do you kill your customers. And so if you're engaged in trade, there's less likely to be war. But in government policy, that's where a lot of these things, because the rules and regulations that govern international trade, that govern the introduction of technology, and how we respond to those changes in society is all about government policy. And one of the things that's been done going back to the 1960s, which ultimately led to the election of Ronald Reagan and the adoption of Reaganomics, which have been proceeding unhindered in the last 40 years, which has produced all these adverse effects, is that the information we're dealing with has been weaponized.
And what is your question? Ask your question.
Well, the question is basically, isn't the introduction of lies into the political debate misguiding people? There's a notion, for example, that lower taxes and less government is going to inspire economic growth, and nothing has really changed in the path of, in the trends towards productivity and so on. What's changed is the distribution of wealth so that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. When we had 90% tax rates, we had the interstate highway system, we had Howard Hughes, and we had the greatest expansion of the middle class.
All right, can you
Your
wrap
question.
it up?
Well, isn't the introduction of lies into the political debate done a great deal to drive us towards adopting policies that have been harmful, not helpful?
This is definitely not my main area of research, but I think if you look back, there have been newspapers and magazines that have reported highly distortive views of the news of the day, dating back to the earliest days of America. So, yes, it appears to me I can't look at the news and I never know on my computer anymore, is that a real story or a fake story? But I don't know, the idea that Americans were not given full information is a new trend. I don't think it's at the core. I think it makes our ability to analyze when you can't tell whether it's who on the web is doing the story. But I think media have newspapers have long had agendas and produced their version of truth.
Do you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah, I would agree that there's always been falsehoods and distortion. I think the difference is everyone was getting the same falsehoods and distortions, and now we are all getting different ones. So
Customized.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, over here. And try to just ask your question, please, so we can get to the others. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a simple question. I'm just wondering if there's a correlation, what would be the correlation between domestic economic inequalities and national inequalities, economic inequalities overseas in other countries? Is there a positive correlation between the economic inequalities in this country and another country, or is there a negative correlation or any at all?
Well, I'm going to jump on that one first, and which is that China in particular has gone from destitution to lower middle class in a matter of 30 years or so, and so global inequality has decreased. But that has caused greater inequality in the U.S. So I would say they're, in a broad brush, they're negatively correlated. But what do you?
No, I agree. That's a good example. In China, I think Americans don't understand how, since 1980, how dramatically China has changed. Right, more people have been pulled out of poverty in China by multiples of our entire population. The best study, though, that addresses, I think, that I can use to address your question was there was a very fine study done in the 1990s on the effect of Nafta. And now I go back and look at Nafta and I think, wow, we really spent a lot of energy on what's in fact a very small issue. I mean, right, the China is the bull in the China shop. And the great study was, in fact, they found that areas, again, looking at two-way trade, in fact, increased inequality on both sides of the border. So I agree with the main theme here, but we do have some evidence that in some circumstances, the nature of U.S.-Mexico trade in particular were very tied corporately between the two countries. It led to increases in inequality on both sides. So it can go both ways.
Okay, let's see. Another one on this side. Any questions on this side? Oh, Mark, okay. We'll get to you.
Hi. I have a relatively mundane question given all these others, but given the very low unemployment rate that's being reported, and we may not have empirical data to talk about it right now, but what is your opinion of the potential impact of the $15 minimum wage going to be on the economy? I mean, currently inflation is relatively low, but with a very, very low unemployment rate, what happens when $15 an hour is close to double the federal unemployment minimum wage, right?
Yes.
So any predictions as to where this takes us?
I think it depends where and how quickly it's implemented. Manhattan can withstand a $15 minimum wage much better than upstate New York can, which is why, despite Governor Cuomo's announcements that we now have a $15 minimum wage, it's being phased in very slowly outside of New York City, and they actually haven't even set a date for when it will be phased in some of the most distressed upstate areas. And so Amazon paying $15 an hour, they can afford to do that for a lot of reasons. First of all, they want Walmart's best workers, and they want it so that people who can't command a higher wage are the ones working at Walmart, and people get frustrated, and so then they go to Amazon. It's a business decision for them. Nothing wrong with that. And they also want to reduce turnover, especially around the holidays. You know, you don't want people who work till December 23rd, and then they say, well, I'm off to spend the busiest shipping days of the year with my family, and so they reduce the risk that people will quit these transient jobs if they make it worth their while to stay. They can afford that nationwide, but can a small supermarket in rural Arkansas afford $15 a year? Probably not. And so then they lose business to Amazon. Then we have a greater concentration of the retail industry. And I think the federal government understands the regional tensions and the regional difference. So we'll probably get more modest increases nationwide. But over time, I think the higher minimum wage, it accelerates the push to automation of the retail jobs, where you order your food on a kiosk at McDonald's in Europe because the wage is higher. Amazon, of course, is investing a lot of money themselves in robots and other technology, in especially very low margin industries that are already struggling, like apparel or the smaller retailers. It just pushes them more toward consolidation and automation. So you may have fewer people with these jobs, and the jobs pay much better, but what happens to the people who don't have those jobs? You know, we haven't figured that out yet.
So very quickly, let me just say, I think if I had to choose one of the two, move to $15 an hour or index the minimum wage so it changed with the CPI, I would definitely choose the latter. Right? It seems to me the big problem is we've allowed the minimum wage to stay at levels despite rising prices in other areas. And so this point about regional issues, my daughter was in San Francisco, $15 an hour. They can't get people to work at McDonald's. They can't get workers in San Francisco. Even $15 an hour, it doesn't solve their worker problem. But as a general statement for workers, their problem is that once the minimum stays at these levels, we should have a national policy that just like Social Security, it goes up. They announce it on January 1st, nationwide it goes up. That should be our policy. We can't trap workers for 15 or 20 years at the same wage.
Okay, let's see a show of hands because we don't have that much time left. Okay, the lady in the middle there. You.
I'm raising my hand.
No.
The woman over there. She said,
Oh, sorry. You have had your hand up. I'm so sorry. Yeah, thank you.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Oh, quick question. I had heard that having a guaranteed minimum income would be a fair consequence of technology and international trade having hurt so many people. Do you think that a guaranteed minimum income would ever work?
Sorry.
Just one thing I'll say before the two experts weigh in is that any guaranteed minimum income probably really wouldn't help the middle class because it would almost invariably be set lower than a middle class living standard.
I think, yeah, I would agree with that. And it really depends what the guaranteed income is. If you're talking $10,000 a year, and does that mean that you replace your existing benefits? So you're not getting Medicaid, you're not getting food stamps. That's very different than a guaranteed minimum of $50,000 a year for everyone. And I think with a lot of resources where the supply does not expand with the demand, all you do is recreate the same inequalities at a higher level. I mean, there's only so many good apartments in good neighborhoods. I mean, we can talk about building more housing. Well, that's always politically difficult, sometimes for good reasons. And so if suddenly you take people who only have $500 a month for rent and you double that to $1,000 a month for rent, all you've done is given that money to the property owners because they still don't have enough to compete with everyone else who also is getting this higher income level, if that makes any sense. Same with education. You have a lot of people competing for scarce resources, and if you just increase the amount of money that people have to buy those resources and don't increase the resources, you've just increased the price level and benefited the people who sell these scarce resources.
I would add that I think there's the goal of that policy, right? The idea is if you have income, that would allow you to buy more services and goods. There's more than one way that we can achieve that. You could achieve it through some kind of extreme lower taxes or even negative income taxes. So we can do it via the tax code. We don't need to impose it on our corporations. But my concern is what was just mentioned, which is if I give you something to your left hand and I take something else away from your right hand, am I making these really at-risk workers and families any better off? And that is, if we take away other government services that there already are not enough of, by moving you from income of $12,000 to $20,000, but I've taken away child care, free preschool education, et cetera, food stamps, then I'm not sure I've made that worker better off. So we have to really think about, we can't let that be the veil in which other things are taken away.
Oh, boy. Okay. Raise your hand so I can see you. All righty. You're right there.
All right. Oh, okay. Back in the last time there was great inequality, which was in 1929, when Roosevelt came in, basically they tilted the legal structure to favor workers. So you had the National Labor Relations Act, and suddenly you could start unionizing and all that stuff. Well, there were two cases recently. One had to do with non-compete clauses, which apparently now apply to janitors and anybody. Another one had to do with binding arbitration among employees, which precluded any kind of collective action, which is directly contrary to the National Labor Relations Act. And of course now the courts are siding, just like those courts prior to the court packing issue, with business. So basically, workers are essentially being crushed here. And, the entire power structure in this country is designed to screw them. That's really what's going on. And it's all accentuated by this other stuff, but the legal structure is just totally against them now.
So I'm going to ask Tom to answer that, because before you were kind of saying the weakness of labor has a lot to do with technology and trade, but he's pointing out that there are also specific government policies that are weakening labor. What's your reaction?
I agree with him. I say, at the beginning, I think government policy, the big trifecta, and one of them is there's been numerous changes, some small, some big, that all have eroded. There was a statement about workers needing more unions. There's been a variety of things that have changed that have all worked in the direction of challenging workers and worker rights. So I agree with you. Again, that's why I feel like you can't just, by putting tariffs on China, we're not going to make very many American workers better off. There might be some. We need a systematic rethink of what we need to do if we care about the American worker.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah, I agree with the non-compete clauses that is something called a monopsony, which is like a monopoly in reverse, where there's only one buyer. If you are the person employing the janitor, if they can't go and get another job, then that's the same problem that a monopoly poses. This should be only for very high income jobs where you have a labor contract that's tied to you. I can see if you're a basketball player, of course, this can be part of your contract, which you have paid a highly paid lawyer to put together for you. But if you're a teacher or a journalist or what have you, the level of sophistication and the job opportunities available, they don't mandate or merit a non-compete clause.
Okay. Last two questions. Okay.
I wonder what happens to all of the sequestered wealth that gets tied up in inheritance that is not really equitably distributed, that's so undemocratic, I think, of people who've acquired immense accounts of money or wealth or value that is tied up and not released into society at large.
Okay, so for both of you, what do you think of raising inheritance tax and making it harder to escape?
I don't only think of inheritance tax, all privilege that this a class of people.
Okay,
are
but
able-
let's start with inheritance tax. Is this easy to define? And yeah.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm an expert in the inheritance tax. Certainly, the issue of tied up wealth, I think the larger issue than inheritance tax is there is so much wealth and there is nowhere for it to go. And we're seeing these distortions in that it was thought by many people that lowering interest rates back after 2008 would get people back to work because you're freeing up money to put into the economy. But there was enough money with no place to go in the economy. And so where do people put it? If I'm sitting on $1 billion, I'm putting this money into property. So I'm just increasing property values in global cities. That really doesn't have a productive impact on employment. If I'm putting this money into U.S. Treasury bonds, all I'm doing is keeping interest rates low so that consumers can continue to borrow. All of the money that has gone into non-profitable businesses, Uber, tens of billions of dollars in private equity, even though they don't make a profit and they have no real prospect of making a profit anytime soon. There's just a lot of market distortions from too much money chasing too few investment opportunities, and much of that money is intergenerational. Some of it is sovereign wealth funds, but it's not a healthy investment environment.
So I agree, this is a huge problem, right? We can argue whether taxes have negative incentives on whether people want to work or not, but we have very important things services the government needs to provide. And I have no idea why we don't think, at some level, an inheritance tax makes sense. It's certainly not going to change my incentive to work. The idea that when I die in 30 years, that my kids might only get $20 million instead of $200 million, right? So I agree. That is again, to me, it's a terrible direction the government chose to move.
Great, thank you. So I think we did it. Everybody got their questions asked, and we've had a great evening. So, thank you. This was so informative. We're going to go back and say, oh my God, what do we do? But you did give us some sense of some solutions.
I know what you do. Go vote, right? Go vote.
Yeah, that's right. Go vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Good. Yeah.